tried to organize the setup that we have now on the table. So it seems that we have a hard time in generating a debate. I mean, you don't seem to disagree on anything. It's very reconciliatory as it were. And the strategies of reconciliation seem to be based on sort of recognizing the plurality of purposes that can be served by different definitions of death. And the other way of proceeding towards a reconciliation is to distinguish between concepts and criteria, or defining and detecting. It seems, for instance, when I mean, the idea of brain death, as you have been talking about, can be put forth as a criterion. After all, it's not maybe a definition of what death is, but it provides a criterion for detecting or identifying cases of death and things of this kind. But of course, this could perhaps be a place for some debate, for prompting, say, moral issues or things like that. There's an epistemic uncertainty there in detecting or applying those criteria, perhaps. And then the question is how we deal with these uncertainties. And that's partly not just an epistemic issue, but also an ethical issue. So there is some room for debate there, perhaps. I wonder, by the way, why you call that a political definition?
It is political.
Political
it's
because
confirmed, it's a legal issue, and then it's a political issue. Because it's in the law, and the laws are political.
Okay. And the purpose being served by this criteria.
Yeah.
Rather than
and the purpose for the introduction of the brain death legislation in Finland was to get more organ transplants.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
But we are not at the top. I mean, the highest rate of organ transplantations in Nordic countries in Norway. And the Finnish physicians travel to Norway to learn how they are doing it better. They have 2 times more, almost 2 times more organ transplantation than we have. It means a lot for many, many people. Okay, Sariola.
All right. There's a further. I mean, in the opening, I suggested that there are issues of causation around death. Death is caused, and death is a cause of other things. And as this was not, that didn't really much in either of your talks. But I just started wondering, when Sami says that the death of an individual is much more than a mere discontinuation of the biological activities of an organism, what exactly is this much more? I mean, at least some of this much more could be construed as causes and consequences of death in cultural and social terms. But then my question would be, what parts of that much more in cultural social care would actually enter the very concept of death, rather than just being part of its causes and consequences?
That's an excellent question, and I didn't really offer any answer to anything like that, because I didn't subscribe to any specific definition of death. So whether social, cultural, or anything else, I just sort of indicated that the mere biological concept wouldn't include at all such elements of death as well. For instance, you also referred to sorrow or something like that. That could be regarded as relevant to the concept itself. Although again, it's not so clear, of course, what to include in the concept or definition itself. And again, I would probably want to refer back to the pluralistic idea of having different definitions for different purposes, and certainly it's a good thing for, let's say, medicine to stay away from those like unnecessary like extra dimensions that wouldn't be helpful in the medical project of understanding life or death. They would they would just hinder the medical investigation, for instance. You shouldn't pay attention to such irrelevant dimensions of the phenomenon when you are approaching it from the medical point.
I a little bit disagree, because I mean, we have in the hospitals, we have hospital priests, we have
yes, of course,
and so forth. So we try to accept that this is a situation where people face very deep sorrow. And if you don't accept it, then you make harm. Then you harm diagnostics.
What I meant was that when you want to determine the medical cause, for instance, the disease itself, that's your medical context.
That's totally.
Then you don't take into account these social factors or something like that. But then, of course, when you take care of the patient there in the hospital, you also need to, at least to some extent, consider the family and so on.
Okay, with Katarina and then Adrian.
Just to follow up on this last discussion, it seems to me like, yes, this idea of having like different criteria, definitions of that for different purposes sounds like a good one. But then I suppose that most of the difficulties arise in situations where actually different, there must be situations in which different definitions conflict, and that's where that's where the difficulties arise. And now, I'm not an expert, but I can think about the discussion on whether to declare someone dead when his brain stops working. That's actually a case in which whether you take a more a different definition, like less biomedical definition of life and death, that might matter. It's just to say that this is just to try to complicate a bit matters for Sami, perhaps, in the sense that this idea that different definitions are good for and criteria that be good for different purposes is good one on paper, but then its value is going to be put in question when you actually have situations in which different definitions are going to give you different practical consequences, and then you have to choose one. Which one? Are we going to go with the biomedical one, or are we going to go with a more cultural, social one?
So I think that this is a very important question, because it's not a philosophical and it's not a biomedical issue, it's a religion that defines. The different religions define how we think of the embryogenesis. In Catholic countries, the life begins and the human begins by fertilization, at fertilization. And it means that it's a one single egg and nothing else. But still, the Catholic Church is considering it as a human being. And that's why the abortions are illegal in Catholic countries. So that if you are raped in Ireland, then you can't get abortion, even though the outcome is result of illegal act. But it's not a philosophical issue. It's a religious issue. Where this most diversity is seen.
Right. But I guess the philosophical issue might be precisely this: that in cases of conflict, we don't really have here any like final or meta level definition of death or theory of death that would then tell us what to do, which more specific or context embedded or interest relative definition to rely on when there is a complicated case. And I completely agree, that's a major problem here. I don't think there would be any need for this kind of discussion if there wouldn't be such problems in the first place. And that's precisely why we need, for instance, ethical reflection. And the work of a moral philosopher, for instance, cannot simply be constructing some elaborate argument that finally leads to the view that a certain action is morally permissible or impermissible. It would have to be also a reflection on these different contexts in which different purposes or interests are at work, and and which may then lead to different ways of even defining the relevant concepts, such as the concept of death. And that's why I don't think there is any easy way to like a final solution to that kind of difficulties. It often needs kind of a case-by-case reflection. Very often matters of life and death in, let's say, in a hospital context are like really unique phenomena that needs to be reflected on in a also a very personal manner, and of course religious beliefs held by the patient or the family or whatever might come to the picture there. But I suppose we should, from the philosophical point of view, we probably should be opposed to the idea that religion simply determines us to think in a certain way. We should obviously take a critical attitude to that.
This follows on from that. I'm interested in this idea about, I suppose, the pluralism that you were talking about, Sami, and also the conflict between naturalistic understandings of death and the humanistic ones. And I suppose the question here is whether there's a, I mean, are you suggesting, you're both suggesting that there's a plurality of questions, depending on the question will determine the appropriate model of death. Part of the reason I'm asking is because Sami, you were talking about Kant and in his project, and in that sense, Kant was looking at questions of free will about deterministic accounts of causation, human agency, compared with ones that rely on reasons, if you want to put it that way, and mental entities giving rise to actions. And there's a fundamental conflict. I mean, you take the Kantian project, he's talking about where there's completely different interpretations of the event that are clearly at conflict. But I just wonder whether, in this case, is there a conflict between the naturalistic and the humanistic accounts of death, similar to what Kant was worried about?
Well, if you're asking me,
but also it just looks like there's, most of the time there's different questions being asked, different problems, and occasionally there's conflict when you come up to cases like this case you're talking about religion. Where when we define death, so religious groups will say death or life begins at a certain stage and so on. They're sort of pragmatic policy issues. Is there a fundamental conceptual kind of conflict here between these naturalistic and humanistic accounts of death?
Well, the reason I very briefly invoked Kant, I didn't really talk about Kant, I just briefly mentioned that this very issue or this idea to have some kind of a synthesis between the medical and the humanistic perspectives would be Kantian in the sense that also Kant, it was a major concern for Kant to somehow make in his days deterministic natural science and then moral responsibility principles of the freedom of the will somehow compatible. And of course you could disagree endlessly about interpretations of Kant, and I'm not sure I have any coherent interpretation to offer, but in a way it comes back to the idea of having like a plurality of different ways of seeing one and the same matter or one and the same thing. Namely, if we think about human actions, they, in a way, they are, of course, from Kantian point of view, they are part of the deterministic natural world as natural events among any others. But then again, they are also seen in a different way, from a different perspective, the perspective of morality or practical reason. There are also actions that are freely that we freely commit and we're responsible for. So in that sense, it's a matter of adopting a very broadly Kantian perspective on this whole issue. I don't want to add something to this in particular?
Well, so pluralism isn't so much a problem. It's more of a problem in accounting. You know, a set of problems that Kant was worried about, pluralism would be a problem because he was trying to understand the relationship between, you know, deterministic world and world in which, you know, human freedom actually had an effect that was causally efficacious. So, I'm just curious because this seems a slightly different problem because pluralism seems okay because there's different questions being answered. You know, whereas in Kant's case, it was the same question that, you know, the different approaches were oriented towards.
Well, I'm not sure different questions or. Of course, to talk about pluralism is already to update Kant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. You can just take Kant and apply a Kantian position to this. I mean, today you would have to bring Kant to this kind of discussion in some reinterpreted way, or at least you have to go beyond Kant's own views. And if we were to talk about Kant here directly, then we would probably have to invoke his theory of immortality as well, and that leads to completely different discussions. So
the only way for us to become immortal is to become cancer. That's the only solution.
Okay, Mr. Green.
Well, for practical purposes, the definition and certainly criteria of death as opposed to life are necessary. I wonder how useful it is in philosophical general terms to understand death and life as dichotomies or as a dual pair of categories. I wonder if Sami's pragmatic pluralism does it involve or include the possibility of understanding death and life as a kind of a continuum where there's different types of life and different types of death, and also different degrees of life and death. Your beloved example of non-life, the stove, already interacts with organic material a lot, and minerals are an essential part of life, and so on and so forth. I mean, can you, Sami, extend your pluralism to kind of a non-dichotomic understanding?
yeah, I mean, Hannu probably wants to continue about this, but maybe if you're asking directly about my approach to that, I would be happy to at least take seriously the possibility of having such a non-dichotomous understanding of death and life. They are in any way they are concepts and phenomena that are inextricably tied to each other. You can't understand one without the other, whether or not you're concerned with defining them. You can't have any sort of understanding without them, without also understanding the other to some extent. And for instance, as the difficulties in clearly identifying when the process of dying begins, for instance, or when the moment of death occurs. I think those would already be examples that point toward the kind of continuation that you seem to be invoking. Maybe Hannu wants.
Yeah, because I mean this is exactly what we think, but we can talk about death only when we are talking about multicellular organisms. Basically, the bacteria do not die. They multiply and they are destroyed. But the multicellular organism must die. And the fact is that, again, you have here an exception. And the exception comes from the slime molds. They are unicellular. But then when they start breeding, they gather together and they make the breeding organ, the mushroom. And then they send out the spores, and the breeding organ is needed for this process. After that, it doesn't die. It just is shedding out, and then they continue life being unicellulars again. There is no death whatsoever in this process.
Yeah, I appreciate the complexities in defining life, but at some point it seems that defining death would bring in additional complexities, and I'm wondering whether that is really necessary. So I would be inclined to say death is the loss of life, and then that might seem very simple, but might trigger a biological approach, for instance. But then all the complexities you would want to raise, you can raise in relation to life. And you still have this very simple definition of death. You can even talk about graduality or matter of degree, because loss might be a matter of degree. So what about death as the loss of life? All right. Go ahead.
Define the life first. It's perfect. It's a perfect definition.
I think it's fine as a very general definition.
Yeah.
We might need to have, for other purposes, we might need more specific.
Yeah, but even for religious purposes, this might work, because the loss of life triggers all kinds of emotions and perhaps thoughts about the afterlife. So even for that purpose, it might get you quite far. I mean, yeah.
Well, I was thinking, actually, it's quite related to that point, because I was thinking when you were talking about the chances for women that, you know, a lot of pregnancies don't go past the first weeks or whatever. I mean, I think one of the problems with how we process it is precisely we conceive of these as deaths. And really, if there's loss of life and there wasn't life to begin with originally, we should be just conceiving them as sort of quite apart from whether the death and life discussion. So in one sense, it's almost like stones. I mean, that's not to deny that people can suffer and feel a lot of grief in that sense, but it seems to me that one of the reasons one should, I'm a philosopher myself, but should take the biomedical classification seriously is that some things that we, you know, naturally would conceive of death and life might not in fact be death or life at all, and that, you know, biomedicine has some way of assisting us in thinking about it. But I guess you could take the other route and say, no, that this just shows that biomedicine is wrong, and we should, you know, conceive of, you know, very early fetuses as living as well. But then I would say then you're probably more religiously inclined or something.
Maybe if I can add something to that, just as a matter of clarification, when I said, for instance, that we may need to use different definitions for different purposes, that of course doesn't mean that any such definition or any such purpose would be as good as any other. I mean, we obviously we ought to be very critical of, for instance, certain religious or pseudo-religious ways of defining life in such a way that, for instance, some practices such as abortion become, for instance, completely forbidden as they might be in some religious groups. And that I think is again a matter where you need some philosophical reflection and also a reflection on the purposes for those definitions.
One aspect is the multitude of definitions, because I mean different cultures, the people think completely different. And Scott Gilbert has written a book on this topic, on bioethics. And for example, he tells a story about the Indians that gave the name for the babies at the age of 2, because it makes sense to give names for younger babies, because they died in numbers. When it looked like that they can survive, then they got the name. And their life began only after 2 years of age, so to say. Personalized life, with name.
Whereas in the Christian tradition, again, it's so different, because then you think that you have to give a name to the baby very early, because there is the idea that God calls the person personally by name, and so that kind of religious background idea is somehow part of the language for the child is understood.
In our society that has the lowest perinatal mortality rate in the world, every single child is valued so much that if you go to developing countries, I mean the death rate is 10 times higher. And people are used to these deaths and they don't so much worry about this because it's normal and then it's natural. Here it's absent and it's unnatural.
Okay, maybe I can try a sort of interim summary of some of these ideas. There's a multiplicity of concepts and criteria of death, and those might be justified in terms of making them relative to certain purposes. I mean, one definition of criteria serves those purposes, another some other purposes, etc. And this would sort of help relocate the debate as a debate maybe about those purposes. Maybe those purposes did require further justifications and maybe evaluation and maybe even ranking, some of them being more important than others, etc. And those purposes should also be put in relation to the relevant context or situation. Some purposes are okay in some contexts, but not in other contexts. So, but then again, I wonder if some purposes or some purposes in some context are not okay at all. They sort of become illegitimate purposes in those contexts. Then does not that reflect back to the concept or criteria that has been proposed in the first place. So this would sort of first be relocated the debate as a debate about purposes in context, but can't we now have a debate over these concepts themselves?
Maybe my immediate reaction to that would be that if we think of the questions concerning the justification of the different purposes, and maybe even the entire contexts, if we take that seriously and understand that as a kind of an ethical problem or need for needing ethical reflection, then what seems to follow is that the very project of engaging in the definition itself or considering the different definitions in relation to the purposes and contexts, that it's all the way from the beginning an ethical project, or at least there is an ethical dimension there all the way from the start. And so what that would mean then is that we can't really separate let's say the ontological and the maybe not the epistemological either, but at least the ethical dimension or the possibility of asking for an ethical justification for a certain practical context or purpose would be there already in the beginning when we consider the different definitions for the concepts. So I don't think that we could first just settle at an ethically neutral level what death is, and then consider the ethical questions that need to be considered when we need to think about our relation to death and life.
The question is also the value of life. I mean, does it have a superior value over death? And in our life, I mean, we can see and witness that it doesn't. Because the society is full of violence and mass murders and so forth, so that it's somehow people they have taken the power in their own hands, and they have decided that they have the right to kill others. But then this is what we know, but I mean then one aspect is psychological aspect of being involved in death constantly. And that's really killing. And I know a couple of physicians working with intensive care units of preterm babies that have quit because they say that they didn't feel anything anymore. I mean, when you see constantly children dying, and then you can't, and you always fail. Of course, you sometimes don't, but I mean, then they see also these failures. that gives you a very negative feedback, and that leads to depression, and that is really awful situation. So that the sorrow that you can see with the death in the parents also is reflected to the medical staff. And I think that it would be very nice to combine the definitions of death, the sorrow feelings, because I mean, it's not neutral, never. It shouldn't be, at least it shouldn't be neutral.
I think that's mostly applicable to human deaths, though. I mean, death should be applicable to all organisms. If we include sorrow in the definition, then, I mean, if an organism with just a few cells dies, I'm not sure if anyone is going to mourn it. Did it still die, though?
You are a philosopher, you can do these.
I think this is precisely the kind of case where we need this context sensitivity, so to say, and if we're interested in human death in particular, then sorrow is indeed something that we might want to include in the very, somehow in the very concept, or at least the possibility of feeling sorrow or something.
If you are stepping on an ant and you are sorrow, feeling sorrow afterwards, you are.
I just would perhaps agree more with something that Uskali was talking about earlier, that, well, you didn't use sorrow as an example, but that sorrow would be a consequence of death, or a possible consequence of death, particularly in the death of humans, but that it wouldn't be a part of the definition of death. I think it's not a necessary condition for death.
Certainly there are human deaths with no sorrow. I mean, somebody who just dies alone with no people at all, even though, I mean, that at least it's conceivable that there is no sorrow at all.
Or if the last human on the planet dies, and there's no one left to mourn her or him.
Maybe he's sorry about that.
Of course, then you could invoke such a notion as possible sorrow or whatever.
Doesn't that seem to be stretching it a little bit there?
Yes.
To be complicating matters beyond what's necessary?
Yeah, I agree.
Well, this cultural dimension has been mentioned as somehow significant for this issue, but so these concepts and criteria of death might be relative to cultures. In different cultures, there are different attitudes towards death, different behavioral patterns towards death, related to death, different cultural significance and values attached to death and life and so forth. And I think this might be a very important observation in contemporary world with all this globalization and all that, all these emerging conflicts here and there, all this sort of intercultural killing that goes on and all that. If different cultures appreciate death in different terms, then that's sort of an additional problem for these intercultural conflicts.
Or even if they even have different concepts of death, if they even define it. But that, as I mentioned, one of the problems there is, of course, this so-called cultural relativism, whatever we mean by that in more detail. I mean, then if any cultural understanding of death is as good as any other, then we're also getting into deep problems.
Right. Think of the legal consequences. I mean, how will that be accommodated in international law and so forth. Okay, I think there is some action.
No, it's just a small comment. I wanted to disagree with something I think was said before, that it would be perfectly fine to define death as the loss of life and then find the definition of life, because I think that's quite debatable. A lot of religions or other practices don't see death as anything that is lost as much as something that is gained. So you have all these ideas of death as simply a transition or death as a process. So the idea of loss, I don't think that's enough to define death and starting from life. You need something more. If you want to account for these other people who think that death is not a loss, but is a gain or a process and so on.
The things you mentioned don't need to be part of the concept of death itself, right? And of course, the transition and all that we can conceptualize as connotations of death, but it doesn't need to be part of the meaning.
Yeah, but I think there are at least some cultural practices that do want that to be, to not be related essentially to the idea of loss. I think that's part of it's one way of defining that as loss, but I don't think everyone would agree with that. I mean, I'm not giving my personal opinion, I'm just stating that some cultures don't think that as loss.
Okay, I think it's time to bring this to an end. I want to thank our speakers. It was very, very interesting and exciting and deep. Given that we are all going to die, I would urge you to hurry and complete your project.